I ran out the back door of my aunt's house on Christmas Eve, with nothing but a garbage bag half full of clothes and a bruise forming along my jaw where her ring had caught me. The snow was coming down hard in Barrie that night, the kind that muffles everything, and I remember thinking how quiet the street was for a holiday, like the whole neighborhood had agreed to look away. My name is Nora Callahan, but for most of my life, the people who were supposed to love me called me whatever was convenient. The girl. Her. Sometimes just a sharp knock on the wall beside my door at 5 in the morning when my aunt needed something done before she left for work. I want to tell you how I got here. And I want to tell you how it ended. Because it did end not the way I imagined it when I was 10 years old, crying into a dish towel in a basement kitchen in Ontario, but in a way that I think is better, more real. My mother died when I was 6. A car accident on the highway outside of Sudbury. February. Black ice. My father, I was told, had left before I was old enough to remember his face. So when my mother's sister, my Aunt Patricia, stepped forward and said she would take me in, the caseworker from Children's Aid Society looked relieved. I remember her face clearly. She had a lanyard with a smiley face clip on it, and she squeezed my hand and told me I was going somewhere safe. Patricia Holt was 41 years old when she took me in. She lived in a 2-story house in Barrie with her husband, my Uncle Dwight, and their 2 biological children, my cousins Marcus, who was 9, and Jillian, who was 7. The house smelled like plug-in air fresheners and cigarettes underneath, and the basement where I slept had one small window at ground level that showed me nothing but boots and ankles when people walked by on the sidewalk. I understood my role in that house within the first week. Marcus and Jillian had chores listed on a chart on the fridge. Wipe the bathroom counter, put shoes by the door, feed the dog on Saturdays. Their jobs were small and they forgot them constantly and nothing happened when they did. My jobs were not on any chart. They existed in my aunt's mouth, and they changed daily. Scrub the baseboards, iron Dwight's work shirts, peel the potatoes, sweep the garage, rewash the dishes because she said I'd left water spots, get up earlier, stay quieter, disappear faster. I was 7 years old when I learned that if I finished everything before she woke up, the morning was peaceful. So, I started setting a mental alarm. 5:30. Sometimes 5. I would move through that house in the dark like a small ghost, wiping counters and folding laundry and trying not to exist too loudly. What I did not understand, not until many years later, was that my aunt was receiving a monthly subsidy from the province for my care. Not a large amount, but steady. And that money was not spent on me. It paid for Jillian's figure skating lessons. It paid for Marcus's hockey equipment. It paid for the gym membership Patricia talked about but never used. I was the invoice. They just didn't want the product. School was the only place I breathed. My teachers noticed I was quiet and assumed I was shy. One of them, a woman named Mrs. Okafor in grade 4, pulled me aside once and asked if everything was okay at home. I said yes. I had already learned that saying yes was the only answer that didn't make things worse. That night my aunt got a call from the school routine. Nothing alarming, and she told me afterward that if I ever made her look bad in front of anyone, I would regret it. She didn't explain what that meant. She didn't have to. I made it through elementary school this way, head down, useful, invisible. The year I turned 13, Dwight lost his job at the mill and things in the house shifted. He drank more. Patricia's moods became unpredictable in a different way, not just cold and demanding but volatile. Plates got thrown. Voices got loud after midnight. Marcus and Jillian learned to stay in their rooms. I learned to stay in the basement. That same year, something else happened that I wouldn't understand the significance of until much later. Patricia sat me down at the kitchen table and slid a piece of paper in front of me. She said it was a school form. She said I needed to sign it. I was 13 and I signed it without reading it carefully because I had been trained not to ask questions. She folded it up and put it in her purse, and that was the end of it. It was not a school form. I know that now. High school was different only in the sense that I was older and therefore could work. The summer I turned 15, Patricia arranged for me to work at a laundromat 2 kilometers from the house, cash, 3 evenings a week, and all day Saturday. She collected the money. She told me it was going toward my keep. I nodded and went back to the basement and added it to the long list of things I did not let myself think about too hard. But something was changing in me. I started reading. Not just for school, everything. I read about tenant rights because a girl in my English class mentioned her parents fighting with a landlord. I read about labor law because something in me needed to understand where the lines were. I read about family law in a library book I carried in my backpack for 3 weeks and returned before anyone could ask why I had it. I was building something. I didn't know what yet. The Christmas Eve that changed everything started like all the others. Patricia had her sister and brother-in-law over for dinner, people who lived in Collingwood and only visited twice a year. My job was to cook, not help cook, cook. The turkey, the roasting vegetables, the mashed potatoes, the pie that had to be made from scratch because Patricia had told her sister she was an excellent baker. I had been in that kitchen since 7 in the morning. It was past 9 at night. The guests were full and laughing in the living room, and I was standing at the sink washing the roasting pan, my hands red from hot water, when I heard my aunt's voice carry through the door. "She's basically like having live-in help," she said. And then she laughed. And her sister laughed too. I stood very still with my hands in the water. Something that had been coiled in my chest for 11 years made a sound like a door unlatching. I dried my hands. I walked to the living room doorway. My aunt looked up, annoyed she didn't like me appearing in front of guests unless summoned. "I'm going to need next Saturday off," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I've applied for a college preparation program in the city, and the orientation is that morning." Patricia's expression shifted, not to anger immediately, first to something calculating, then to something else embarrassed, maybe, because her sister was watching. "We'll talk about this later," she said. "I'd like to know now," I said. "Please." I don't know why I added the please. Old habit. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Patricia stood up from her chair. She crossed the room faster than I expected, and her hand came across the left side of my face so hard I stumbled back into the doorframe. The room went completely silent. Her sister said, "Patricia." Dwight said nothing. Patricia straightened her blouse and said, "Go to the basement." I looked at her for a moment. I looked at her sister, who was staring at her plate. I looked at Dwight, who was looking at the wall. I looked at my cousins, Marcus and Jillian, who were both 19 and 21 now and sitting very still. And then I went to the basement. But not the way she meant. I picked up the garbage bag I had packed 3 weeks earlier and kept hidden behind the old water heater. I put on my coat and my boots. I went up the back stairs and out the back door and into the snow. I walked to the Tim Hortons on Dunlop Street because it was open and warm, and no one looked at you strangely for sitting alone on Christmas Eve. I ordered a tea I couldn't afford, and I sat in a corner booth and I called the one person I had kept the number for a legal aid line I had found during my months of reading. It went to voicemail. I left a message. I sat with my tea until it was cold. At some point, a woman 2 booths over caught my eye. She was maybe 60, alone herself, with a paperback and a large coffee. She looked at me, just looked, not unkindly, and said, "Rough night?" I said, "I just left a bad situation." She nodded like that was a complete sentence. "You have somewhere to go?" I told her I was working on it. She wrote down the address of a women's shelter on a napkin and slid it across to me. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just went back to her book. I stayed at that shelter for 11 days. They were patient with me. A caseworker named Denise helped me apply for emergency housing assistance and walked me through what my options were. When I told her about the years of unpaid labor, she got very quiet and started writing things down. When I mentioned the paper I had signed at 13 without understanding it, she looked up. "Do you know what you signed?" she asked. I told her I thought it was a school form. She told me to describe it as precisely as I could. 3 weeks later, Denise introduced me to a legal aid lawyer named Mr. Anand Bhattacharya, who worked with a clinic in Barrie. He was young, maybe 30, with a careful way of speaking that made you feel like he was weighing every word before he released it. He sat across from me in a small office with a dying plant on the windowsill, and he asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I did. It took almost 2 hours. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nora, I need you to understand something. What you signed when you were 13 was not a school form. Based on what you're describing, I believe it was a document surrendering a legal claim to your maternal grandmother's estate." I stared at him. "Your grandmother, your mother's mother, passed away when you were 12, he said. "She left a will. She left a modest estate. And based on the timing you've described, I believe your aunt had you sign away your portion of that inheritance before you were old enough to understand what you were doing." My grandmother. I had met her twice. I remembered a small woman with very soft hands who smelled like lavender and looked at me like I was something precious. I did not know she had died. Patricia had not told me. I sat in that chair for a long time without speaking. "Mr. Bhattacharya said, this is going to take time to investigate. I want to be honest with you about that. But if what you're telling me is accurate and verifiable, we have grounds for several serious claims. Fraud, coercion of a minor, potential breach of fiduciary duty, and the labor issue is separate. We may be able to pursue unpaid wages through a different mechanism." He slid a notepad across the desk and asked me to write down every detail I could remember. I wrote for 40 minutes. The investigation took 7 months. I know that sounds long. For some of those months, I was working at a grocery store in Barrie and renting a room from a woman named Greta, who charged me $350 a month and left soup outside my door, sometimes without saying why. I turned 19 in that rented room. I bought myself a cupcake from the bakery across the street, and I sat by the window and watched it snow, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the days ahead of me were mine to fill. Mr. Bhattacharya called me in February. He had found the will. He had found the estate records. And he had found something else, records from the CAS, showing that the monthly subsidy, paid to Patricia for my care, had continued for 2 years past the point where it should have been reassessed, due to a document submitted by my aunt that contained information inconsistent with the records on file. In simpler terms, she had submitted false information to extend her payments. He also found a neighbor, a woman named Brenda Kowalski, who had lived 3 doors down from Patricia's house for 14 years, who had contacted the legal aid clinic voluntarily after hearing through a community network that a case was being investigated. Brenda said she had witnessed, on multiple occasions, a young girl in that house performing labor that no child should have been performing. She had called CAS once, years ago, and been told the file was in order. She had not stopped feeling guilty about it since. I cried when Mr. Bhattacharya told me about Brenda. I don't know exactly why. I think it was because someone had seen, someone had noticed and carried it and never let it go. It mattered to me more than I expected. The case went before a civil court judge in Barrie in late spring. I was 19 years old, sitting in a courtroom in a blazer I had bought second-hand, and altered myself, and I watched Patricia walk in with her own lawyer and refuse to look at me. Dwight was not there. They had separated the previous autumn. I found out later that Jillian had also refused to attend and had written a letter to the court that I was not allowed to read, but that Mr. Bhattacharya said contained statements that were helpful to us. My aunt's lawyer argued that I had signed the document voluntarily, that I had been a quiet, cooperative child with no apparent objections, that the subsidy discrepancy was an administrative error, that any work I performed in the house was normal household contribution expected of any family member. Mr. Bhattacharya stood up, and he was very calm and very precise. He presented the will. He presented my grandmother's estate records. He presented the timeline that showed I was 12 years old, in the care of my aunt, when my grandmother died, and that I had never been informed. He presented the CAS payment records. He presented Brenda Kowalski's testimony. He presented records from my high school, noting consistent absences on days that correlated with my documented work schedule at the laundromat. Then he sat down. The judge, a woman named Justice Osei, looked at my aunt for a long moment over her glasses. She said, "I am going to take a short recess." She came back 22 minutes later. "Justice Osei found in my favor on the inheritance claim. The document I had signed at 13 was voided on the grounds that a minor cannot legally waive a significant financial right without proper legal counsel and informed consent, neither of which had been provided. Patricia was ordered to repay the value of my share of my grandmother's estate, $46,000, along with interest accumulated over the years it had been withheld. On the subsidy matter, the judge referred the findings to the appropriate provincial authority for further investigation. That process was separate. I was told later that Patricia received a substantial financial penalty and was permanently barred from receiving any future provincial care payments. On the labor matter, the judge noted the documented pattern and awarded me a further amount in damages. Patricia did not look at me when the decision was read. Her shoulders went very still and she stared at the table in front of her, and I watched her, and I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter. Like a window being opened in a room that has been sealed for years. What happened after that took more time than the movies would have you believe. I did not walk out of the courthouse into a perfect life. I walked out into a Tuesday afternoon in May, blinking in the sunlight, with Mr. Bhattacharya shaking my hand and telling me his team would be in touch about the transfer of funds. I went home to Greta's house and I made pasta for dinner, and I sat at the small kitchen table and I thought about my mother. I thought about her hands on the steering wheel. I thought about the black ice. I thought about the caseworker with the smiley face lanyard who had squeezed my hand and said I was going somewhere safe. She had meant it. She had just been wrong. I used the money to finish my education. I enrolled in a social services program at Georgian College in the fall. I wanted to understand the systems. I wanted to know where the gaps were, the ones that children like me fell through. Not to be angry about them, though I was, sometimes, in the evenings, but because someone has to know where the holes are if anyone is going to patch them. There is one more thing I want to tell you. 8 months after the court decision, I received a letter at Greta's address. It had been forwarded through the legal clinic. It was from a man named Robert Callahan, written in careful, slightly formal English on plain white paper. He said he was my father. He said he had left Sudbury not because he chose to, but because of circumstances involving my mother's family that he had never stopped regretting. He said he had tried to find me after my mother died and had been told by Patricia, through a series of communications he could now see were deliberately misleading, that I had been placed with another family and that contact was not appropriate. He said he was living in Halifax. He said he was not asking for anything. He said he thought I deserved to know he had looked. I read that letter 4 times. I put it down. I made tea. I read it again. I wrote back 2 weeks later. Nothing dramatic. Just that I had received his letter and that I was open to talking. We have been talking ever since. He is not a perfect man, and I am not a perfect daughter, and we are figuring out what we are to each other, with the carefulness of 2 people who know how much can be lost when you assume. He came to Barrie last Christmas. We had dinner at a restaurant on Dunlop Street, not far from the Tim Hortons where I had sat in a corner booth on Christmas Eve with a cold tea and a napkin with a shelter address written on it. We ordered too much food. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about my mother when she was young, things I had never known, how she laughed, what music she liked, how she had been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and wrote actual cards. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment, my own apartment now, a small one, with a window that looks out onto a real street, and I thought about all of it. The basement window that showed me nothing but boots. The 5:30 mornings. The garbage bag behind the water heater. The napkin. Brenda Kowalski, who had never stopped feeling guilty. Justice Osei and her 22 minutes. The long way around to myself. If you are in something right now that feels like it will never end, I want you to hear this. Document everything you can. Dates, amounts, names, what was said, and by whom. Write it down somewhere safe, even if it is just notes in your phone or folded paper in your shoe. The details you think are small are often the ones that matter most later. And reach out to legal aid clinics, to community organizations, to school counselors, to neighbors who look at you with that particular kind of steadiness that means they have noticed and they care. Those threads exist in every community. Sometimes you have to pull one to find the others. Children cannot consent to what they do not understand. Adults in positions of trust have a legal and moral obligation to act in the best interests of those in their care, and when they fail that obligation, the law has remedies. They are slow, they are imperfect, but they exist. And sometimes, a woman with a paperback in a Tim Hortons on Christmas Eve writes an address on a napkin and slides it across the table. And that is where the rest of your life begins.